So the British Academy is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. It mobilises these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. It is an independent fellowship of world-leading scholars, a funding body for research and a forum for debate. Held in partnership with universities across the UK, the Academy's lecture programme, curated by its fellows, showcases the very best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences, stimulates debate, and reflects the breadth of these subjects and academic perspectives within them. This event is part of the Sir John Rhys Memorial Lectures in Celtic Studies. And in 1924, the Academy was given the proceeds of an appeal fund to set up a memorial for the late Sir John Rhys, FBA. The Academy decided that the memorial would take the form of a lecture or paper or monograph on a Welsh or other Celtic theme, and the first lecture was delivered in 1925. I am absolutely delighted to introduce today's speaker, and that is Professor Gordon Noble. So Gordon Noble is a Professor of Archaeology at the University of Aberdeen. His Northern Picts Comparative Kingship Research Project won the current Archaeology Research Project of the Year in 2021. Over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Vicky. Can you all hear me okay? Let's see whether the captions keeps up with my Scottish accent. Right, so thank you very much. Tonight I'm going to be talking about one of our big projects at the moment run through the University of Aberdeen, and it's been funded by Historic Environment Scotland, by Leverhulme Trust, and a whole host of other funders, so thanks to them. And what I'm going to be talking to you tonight about is the Picts of Northern Scotland, or what became Scotland. So these are a group that were located north of the Roman frontier. They're first mentioned in Roman sources in AD 297, and essentially it's a nickname. It means the painted people, so the barbarians living north of the frontier. And they seem to be an amalgamation of earlier groups that are mentioned by the Romans, and this is one of the things that happens at these frontier locations. This coming together of polities bordering the Roman Empire and creating the foundations for these new late Roman groups that go on to become these powerful series of kingdoms in northern Britain. One of the big problems with looking at Pictish history and archaeology has traditionally been the lack of evidence. So this is due to the fact that our sources for the Picts are almost exclusively external. So late Roman sources initially, and then in the post-Roman period, we have Irish and Anglo-Saxon sources talking about the Picts living in northern Britain. And so our Irish sources, for example, are these annal entries, and they often just record simply, the death of a particular Pictish king, the location of battles, or occasionally significant places amongst the Picts. So they're really, these one-liners, the tweets of the day, that tell us relatively little about these groups. The other big problem is the lack of archaeological evidence. So when I was first studying the Picts, this is one of the classic texts, The Problem of the Picts, which dates back to 1955, which tells you a lot about Pictish scholarship. This was still a major text in the 90s and 2000s. And this is what Wainwright said about Pictish archaeology. There's no Pictish problem in archaeology because archaeology knows nothing of the Picts. And so that was one of the kind of calling cards for the Northern Picts project, is can we actually identify some of the sites on the ground and begin to illuminate this period, the formation of the first kingdoms we know of in northern Britain. what I'll be talking about tonight also extends through to the Viking Age. So this Pictish identity disappears round about 900 AD, and we get the mention of a new kingdom called Alba, which seems to be some sort of merging of the Picts and another group, confusingly called the Scots, who lived on the west coast, creating this new kingdom in the face, perhaps, of Viking and Scandinavian expansion in northern Britain. So this is one element that we're also looking at through our project is, what happened to some of these major centres of the Picts? What happens around about the late 9th century AD to create this big change within society, or at least how these groups are referring to one another. Sorry, this clicker is not working. Vicky briefly introduced our Northern Picts project. So this was established in 2012, and really what we were trying to do there was just, can we identify some of these Pictish sites, and can we begin to illuminate this time period? And judging by the fact that the project's still going, tells you that we had some success with that. And I'll tell you about one main site that we've been working on today. And this is part of a series of defended settlements that we get in this time period. So when we think about some of the kingdoms of southern Britain, we often think of, royal halls, big timber structures and the like. In northern Britain, the kind of real symbol of kingship and elite power was the defended settlement, or the hill fort is the kind of classic form of this. And these are some of the few sites that are actually mentioned in our sources, places like Dundurn or Dunnottar in Pictland, and they're places in which kings are referred to, they're places where battles and sieges take place, and really they're a manifestation of a particular form of rulership, this warrior kingdoms that are existing in this time period. But here, even with these kind of sites, we probably only have a couple of dozen maximum of these sites. And traditionally, they were often tackled through very small trenches just to get some basic dating evidence. And we've been able to identify that they date to this time period, but often not being able to tell you much more about how these actually function. So again, that's something we've been trying to change through our project, is much larger scale excavations of some of these power centres of the Pictish time period. And when I mentioned that some of these are reference and sources, our sources are quite biased. So here you can see some of the sites that are mentioned in Pictland, which is marked in blue here. So it wasn't the full extent of what we now know of as Scotland, kind of north of the Firth of the Forth. And you can see a lot of our sites were down in what is now central Scotland. And that's probably because they're closest to where the annals are being recorded in places like Iona and in Ireland. Whereas if you go up into northeast Scotland, so Aberdeen's just around about here, you can see that the sites we've identified are not mentioned in our sources, but we can identify them archaeologically through comparison to the sites that are mentioned in the sources. So this brings me to Burghead, which is up on the Moray coast here, just up in this location here. So Inverness is here, Aberdeen here, Edinburgh down here, just to give you some geographical locations. This was formerly the largest Pictish fortification known prior to discovery of Tapanoth, which was another site that we worked on recently, which is a more traditional hill fort located in Aberdeenshire, about 17 hectares in extent. Burghead, about 5.5, 6 hectares, so quite a large site for this time period, but different to our classic hill forts in terms of it's a coastal promontory fort jutting out into the Moray Firth. And we think it was one of the main sites of the over kingdom of the Picts, which was called Fortrue. And it seems to have late 6th early 7th century origins. It's been mapped since the 16th century. So this is Pont's map of Scotland, showing the old Bra, and this is Burghead, the earliest depiction that we have on record. And then into the 18th century, it was recorded by a number of antiquarians like Thomas Pennant and James Cordner. This is a drawing by James Cordner showing the fort, and he describes it as a peninsula made an island. So it's a promontory jutting out in the sea, and then all the ramparts have kind of created a place apart on this north coast here. And this was the site until around about 1800, when unfortunately a large part of the site was destroyed by the construction of a planned village, the modern village of Burghead. And this is James MacDonald's description of it. So the cross ramparts, the landward ramparts being hurled back into the ditches, and the many coins, battle axes and spearheads then found were given to any English tourist who came that way. So that's what happened to poor Burghead in the 1800s. Part of that destruction led to some quite remarkable discoveries, though. So the Picts are famous for their stone carvings, and around about 30 carvings of bulls were found during that process of destruction of the fort. Only 6 of these survive today. This one here is in the British Museum. There's one in the National Museum of Edinburgh, and the others are held more locally. So these were dug up in the fort, somewhere round about the entrance to the upper citadel. There were also fragments of early Christian sculpture. So the Picts were fully Christian, as far as we know, from the 7th century. And there's fragments of cross slabs, a fragment of a shrine, suggesting there was an important church within the fort of Burghead, and that's quite unusual for this time period. And they also discovered, in the process of trying to get a water source for the new village, they found the well of the fort, which is a really, really impressive structure that had rock-cut steps and this big rock-cut basin. And it was presumed to be Roman when it was found because it was so impressive. But this seems to be part of the Pictish fort dating to the 7th and 8th centuries AD. It's had a long history of an investigation. Back in the 1860s, was the first excavations by a guy called James MacDonald. And he created some sections through the ramparts of the fort, just showing you how impressive these were. They're about 8-9 meters wide and about 6 meters high. So they're kind of, castle-like defensives, but built much, much earlier. And this is Hugh Young in the 1890s, who was the grandson of one of the developers of the modern settlement. And this is his excavations, early photograph from the 1890s, showing his workmen in the background here. They weren't worthy of being in the photograph here. So this is the kind of wall face of the fort here. And during those excavations, they found lots of animal bone and some weaponry, an axe head, a spear head here, and an ingot mold, which is associated with metalworking. So some interesting early finds from the site. But the only modern excavations were carried out in the 1960s by Alan Small, who excavated the upper fort ramparts here and got the first radiocarbon dates to show that this was a Pictish site. It wasn't Roman, it wasn't Viking, as people had suggested before. But he also suggested that most of the interior had been destroyed by the construction of the village. And this is what survives today. So this is what you see at Burghead. This is the surviving part of the fort here. This is the rampart wall, or one of them. And then there would have been rampart walls all the way around here. And then there would have been landward defences, which are now covered by the modern town here. So, it's disappointing that part of the fort has been lost, but we do have elements of it still surviving at the end of the promontory today, and probably still parts of it still surviving in people's gardens in the settlement as well. And it was with kind of little hope that we went to look at the site in 2015, just very small scale excavations, and we were digging in the gardens of the Coast Guard station here, which was an unscheduled part of the site. And very excitingly, just within the first few test bits, we came down on the floor of what turned out to be an 8th to 9th century building. And this, in the floor layers here, had coins of King Alfred, had weaponry as part of a sword hilt here. So despite this perception that most of the fort had been destroyed by the construction of the town, what we actually showed was that there was exceptional preservation here. And Pictish dwellings are very hard to identify normally because they were using things like turf for walls and truck frames rather than post-built structures. And so here, Burghead is essentially a big sand dune on the coast here. And so all these buildings have been covered by layers of sand, preserving these structures below. And so we're currently being funded by Historic Environment Scotland as part of a project called the Citadel project. And this is partly funded due to erosion issues. So with rising sea levels, we're having increasing problems on these coastal sites with preservation. So much of the seaward rampart, so the big wall that enclosed the fort, has actually fallen into the sea. And so we are rescuing the archaeology here, particularly in this zone here, prior to further erosion. And then in the lower fort and the lower citadel, we're doing kind of more research-led excavations. So not digging everything, just kind of sampling the areas that are still preserved down here. And once again, we've got really excellent preservation in this part of the fort, despite that perception of it being all completely trashed. And indeed, on this part of the site, we have quite incredible preservation of the wall face here because it was actually built on a slope, sloping down to the coastline here. And then the wall was constructed and then sand filled in to create a level surface in the interior. So that is built up against this wall here, which still stands about 3.5 meters high. And it's one of the best examples of timber-laced ramparts from this time period. So these walls were built using an oak framework, kind of boxes constructed with dry stone walls on either side and then kind of rubble core to them. And every half meter or so, there are layers of timber, in this case still preserved because this rampart was set on fire at some point, which I'll come back to later on. So you can see all the woodwork still preserved through the charred beams here. So it's a bit of a civil engineering job to actually investigate this rampart, but we're doing this prior to the erosion. So what have we established so far? Well, the ramparts seem to date to the 7th to 8th centuries AD, and we can date this through dating the char beams in the wall here, but also all the layers built up against the wall here. So this is a schematic drawing showing the collapse of these huge stone walls through time, covering over the earlier occupation phases, and this is the wall face of the original rampart here. And we can get radiocarbon dates to tell us how old this site was. And what's very clear is just the huge amount of labour going into building this wall. So just about every single stone that's used in the wall face there is hammer dressed. So this is where you use your point chisel and you knock off the face of this lovely sandstone that comes from along the coast at Burghead. And actually, in one of the early years of Burghead, we actually found a Pictish stoneworking chisel, big, huge stoneworking chisel that matches the point chisel marks that you can still see on some of the stones today. So that's really fun. And we've been doing some calculations on the kind of scale of these ramparts here. And so one of our engineering colleagues has worked out it would take something like 760,000 person hours to build the ramparts there, and utilising about 1,000 tons of stone in the 7th century to build this. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, I don't know if you all know these kind of Broch towers you find up in the Northern Isles. The equivalent amount of stone is about 70 of these Broch towers being used to build the ramparts of Burghead. So really, really impressive. And actually, the scale of the ramparts is actually equivalent to the length of rampart used in a slightly earlier site at Tapanoth, which is much larger in scale. So they've utilised those resources and really focused on a smaller but more impressively enclosed sites. What we've also found through working in the interior is just how densely populated this site was. It's almost like a small kind of urban centre. So here in pink is marked where we've been digging, and in orange are the structures that we've found so far. You can see that just pretty much wherever we put trenches in, we find large sub-rectangular buildings. This is an upper fort. We've got something like 12 or 13 structures in the lower fort so far, and it's just a very small area that we've dug so far, and generally just kind of stripping and mapping and characterizing the uppermost settlement layer. So this is the final phase of settlement before abandonment, for example. And you get all sorts of different styles of building as well, which is really exciting because, literally got, a couple of handful of Pictish buildings known from the whole of eastern Scotland. So we've got turf-built structures. So this is part of a turf wall here. These are the floor layers. You can maybe just make out this is a hearth here. And we've got other structures that are kind of sunken dwellings with plank facades to them. So this is really going to hugely increase our knowledge about building styles from this post-Roman period in northern Britain. What were they doing inside this fort? Well, we began to piece that together through the material culture. So this is the work of our colleagues at National Museum of Scotland, looking at some of the artifacts that we've been uncovering at the site. So far, there's evidence for production and presence of weaponry. So this is sword hilts, spearheads here. There's also fine metalworking here. These are kind of crucible sherds from casting things like bronze and silver. And they're also producing sheet metal as well. So these are stone molds. You can maybe just make out the channel here. And these are for pouring in bronze or silver and creating bars that they then trade. But they also hammer out these bars of metal to create sheet metal objects. And we've actually found some of these objects that they may have been making. Oh, sorry, that's just an image of Hugh Young's excavations from the 1890s, finding a very similar mold here to the one that we found last year. And there's also parts of hack silver as well from the early phases of Burghead. And these are some of the kind of sheet metal objects that they might have been making at Burghead. So these are bells, so hand bells, and there's only about 20 of these known from Scotland. So this is a very rare find today, although it doesn't look very exciting from those images. But these were the height of metalworking technology. So they're bronze and iron composite objects. And this one's still got its clapper inside. And you can maybe just make out the handle of the bell here. So it's about this size. Really complex metalworking technology. I'll come back to those later on. And we're also finding complete objects. So normally when you dig settlement sites, you're just finding the kind of stuff that people have thrown away, the scrap, the stuff that you would throw in your rubbish. But Burghead was obviously such a wealthy settlement that we're actually finding complete objects in some parts of the site. So this is a beautiful bronze ring here, finger ring. So that's the ring part here. And you've got the cruciform design here, so early Christian imagery to it. And this is a glass or garnet fitting. And we've got molds for making these objects from places like Broch which is a really important site in the Northern Isles. But here at Burghead, we've got the complete objects. And then the year after that one was found, we found a fragment of another one, again, maybe suggesting they're actually making these rings on site. A really exciting find from last year is, again, a kind of tiny object, and this time it is a scrap. It's just a piece of metal that's been discarded in the floor layer. But this is really, really exciting because you can maybe just make out this beast here, and it's biting the vine scroll here. And this is the kind of imagery you see on some of the really impressive Pictish cross slabs, and you get similar monuments found across Ireland and Wales and Western Britain and into Anglo-Saxon England as well. But this is the first example from Pickland of kind of pressed copper items showing they were making the same kind of imagery for something like a book cover or a processional cross, something of that idea. And that's found in the floor layer of a building, so probably a craft working building reworking this. And this is really, really interesting. So this is one of the really impressive cross slabs you find from northern Scotland of the Pictish era, showing a hunt scene here. So this is someone riding side saddle on a horse here with a mirror and comb, someone playing the pipes here, and they're hunting here. So these are all images I'll come back to in a wee while. But you can see the vine scroll on the side here of this monument, or this cross slab, which would be 8th, 9th century in date. And you can see some of the similar biting beasts here. So that's really exciting to find that. And then at Burghead, we've got some really amazing preservation of beautiful bone objects as well. So mainland Scotland is normally acidic soils, so you don't get good bone preservation. But here at Burghead, because of the sandy soils, and just because of the sheer amount of animal bone you find at the site, we've got preservation of beautiful decorated bone objects. We've got about 12 of these now. And you can see they're all different bespoke designs, some with kind of bramble heads, some imitating jewels, some imitating little weapons or mace heads perhaps. And then other ones that might have had amber insets and also zoomorphic ones. So this is one of my favorite ones, which looks like a ram, we think. So you can see its horns here. So really, really amazing to find these beautiful decorated objects. And Leanne Demey at National Museum of Scotland is beginning to work on these. What are they for? They're so fine that she thinks they can only be for fastening something really fine, parts, bits of silk. But her latest idea is that they might be for headdresses, and women in this time period would have worn headdresses some form. So some of the rare depictions you see of women on cross slabs, they have veils, so they might be for fixing these in place. So that's really, really exciting to see that dimension to the archaeology here. And then also we're getting things like combs. So remember the mirror and the comb on the cross slab there from the Hilton and Cadboll, and other bone objects as well, some with these cross-shaped designs, so this early Christian imagery incorporated onto the objects here. And then we also have objects that speak of longer distance connections as well. So this was a 19th century find from Burghead. It seems to be from a blast or a hunting horn. And this is kind of elite material culture coming from England, probably, finding its way to Burghead. And one of the fragments of carved stone from Burghead shows a warrior on horseback. So this is the sort of thing they might have been carrying on the hunt or in battle. So again, really exciting to begin to illuminate the world we see on the carved stones through the archaeology in the trenches. These are much more modest finds, but these came out last year. And these are little quartzite pebbles. And they're actually painted using peat tar. And they're called painted pebbles. And they might be healing or charm stones. And you get these are referred to in the life of Columba, for example, little quartz stones as used as healing stones. And they're mainly found in the Shetland Isles and Orkney. So they're probably an indication of connections between these mainland Picts and the Northern Isles, which we think they ruled over in the 7th and 8th centuries. And then one really, really important dimension of the site that's really emerged in the last few years is the importance of the kind of animal economy at Burghead. So obviously we've got these bull carvings. Why were they carving so many bulls here at Burghead, and what does this signify? Well, what's really exciting again is the ability of archaeology to kind of illuminate what's going on in the settlement layers here. So we've had some recent work looking at the kind of pollen evidence. So what kind of pollen gets preserved in things like floor layers or midden layers. And one of our colleagues has begun to look at that, and they're absolutely full of fungal spores from animal dung, and includes things like parasite eggs, such as whipworm, from the animals that were kept within Burghead, which makes sense of all the animal bone that we're getting from here. But clearly, they were actually live animals kept within Burghead. And one of the objects that came up a couple of years ago was an ox goad. So this is a little spiky iron object for herding cattle or bulls. So the actual bulls we see on the stones here are probably indicating the kind of animals that were actually kept within the site of Burghead. And of course, our bell as well is interesting in terms of you get two types of these early medieval bells. One is used in church services for calling people to prayer, etc. Others are animal bells, and this seems to be an animal bell. So sort of one you would hang around the neck of a bull or a cow. And this again is really exciting because on Pictish stone sculpture, you occasionally see animals, bulls, with bells around their neck here. And this one from Phallus Wester shows a procession of warriors with someone leading a bull by the strap here with the bell around its neck. So again, what's going on here? Is this some sort of elite procession? Is it some sort of royal procession, perhaps? But again, maybe illuminates the kind of things that's going on at Burghead. And we've actually got the remains of 3 different bells from Burghead now, suggesting they're doing similar things within the fort. And then what we can also do, because we have this amazing bone preservation from Burghead, is begin to look at the kind of life cycles of some of the animals. So most of you might be familiar with the kind of isotopic analysis that people are doing on humans in terms of, you are where you eat, or you are what you eat. So people can track, the life history of people through their diet and through indications of mobility. Well, we've been doing that for the animals from Burghead. And what's really interesting is that the animal bone assemblages is dominated by these 3 domesticated cattle, sheep and pigs. The sheep and pigs, where we've tested them, seem to be reared locally, so either in the fort or nearby, whereas the cattle seem to be coming from all over the place. And that's really interesting, again, in terms of what makes the world go round in the early medieval period in a non-monetary economy. And that's cattle. Cattle are often the real symbol of wealth. And so what we've been doing, our colleagues, Professor Kate Britton at Aberdeen, doing some isotope sampling of the cattle remains. And we've done this for 8 individuals so far, and it's multi sampling of individual cattle teeth, which tells you about where they grew up, if there's any indications they moved in their life cycle. So quite expensive analyses, but quite intriguing. So this is the kind of data that you produce, and you can work out, where these cattle grown up locally, or are they coming from further afield? And so these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 data points we've got so far. And this is the kind of local range you might expect. And so there are only one example of the 8 so far that would definitely probably come from Burghead or somewhere relatively locally. So this is the kind of in orange maps the possible locations they might have been brought from, the cattle. So here's Burghead up here. So probably local, although it could have came from further afield. There's one individual, or a couple of individuals that must have came from the west coast, or maybe the Shetland Isles, or maybe even further afield. And there's some that come from really quite cold places up in the Cairngorms, up in the mountains. And they show some evidence of transhumance, so moving between summer and winter pastures, but not to the Burghead coast. So they're being transhumant in the Cairngorms, but being brought to Burghead at the end of their life. So what this is showing basically is that cattle are being brought from a big range of different places to Burghead, presumably as part of food renders or tribute to what must have been a really important economic and perhaps royal centre of this time period. There is two individuals who are particularly interesting in terms of their isotopic signature is too cold for anywhere in Britain, as far as we understand so far. And the nearest match for them is Scandinavia. So that's quite intriguing. Very long distance movement of cattle, that one. So really, really exciting. So only 1 out of 8 of the cattle we've looked at so far is probably local. The rest are being brought from quite far afield. What we're also finding in the animal bone assemblage is other elements of Pictish life. So remember back to that cross slab that showed indications of people hunting on horseback with hounds, hunting deer. So we've got deer bone from the site. We've got some really quite unusual species as well, like otter, fox, and seals. And we've also got a range of domestic and game fowl, so chickens, gulls, possible crane. But also, very excitingly, just in the last few months, we've identified, or possibly identified, we'll hedge our bets so far, but it looks like we've got evidence for raptors. So evidence of falconry. And again, on some of the Pictish stones, you see evidence of people with hunting birds, for example. And this has often been presumed to just be kind of modeling images from further south or from continental Europe or early Christian imagery, but may well actually be representing the actual practices of hunting elite sports within early medieval power centres like this. What we've also got from Burghead is evidence for a cemetery. So just in an area that's now lost to coastal erosion was a cemetery. And in a box of bones from Hugh Young's excavations, we found a human long bone in amongst a box of animal bone. And we also had the skull that was from the National Museum of Scotland. And we dated those two bones to the 7th and 8th centuries. And this seems to be come from a cemetery that was located just outside the fort in Longkist graves that were found by workmen during, again, the process of destruction of the fort here. So that's really interesting in terms of we'll be able to get DNA and isotopic evidence from 2 of the individuals. And we have evidence from 1 so far, and they are local to Burghead. So this is a Burghead individual who lived and died and was buried at the cemetery just outside the fort. And finally, one other dimension to think about this site is it's not your normal hill fort that we get reference to in our earlier sources. It's this coastal promontory fort jutting out into this really rich maritime environment to the Moray Firth. So it's often been suggested that this might have had a kind of naval dimension to this location. People suggesting it might have been a place in which the Pictish fleet was anchored, for example. And that could be fanciful, but we do actually know that in this time period, in northern Britain at least, that they had fleets. So we have this really unusual survival of army muster for the kingdom of the Scots, Dalriata on the west coast. And as well as talking about land forces, it talks about the navy and having something like 2 7-bench ships per 20 households. So those 7-bench ships would have had 14 people, 14 rowers. So it must have been reasonably impressive sailing vessels in this time period. And there's various references to sea battles on the west coast. We don't have that same reference record for the Picts, again, probably because of the poor survival of sources. But there are hints that the Picts did have a fleet. So, for example, in AD 682, so towards the end of the 7th century, there's a reference in the Annals of Ulster to King Burghead destroying or deleting the Orkneys. So it wasn't just the Vikings who were sailing around and causing havoc. This King Burghead was probably located somewhere on this coastline, maybe even at Burghead, sailed to the Orkneys and destroyed this series of islands here. And there's also an 8th century source, which again is frustrating in its lack of detail, but it talks about the breaking of 150 Pictish vessels at a location which is just to the east of Burghead, again on this Moray coastline here. I can only imagine that this was a war fleet, and actually this reference is in a period in which the Picts are at war with one another. It's during the beginning of the reign of Angus, who's this really powerful Pictish king. And so this is very likely, I think, to be a reference to a Pictish fleet coming a cropper on the rocks here, somewhere along this coast. And so we have to think about, what was the landscape and the environment of Burghead? And obviously it's very different in the past to what it was today. So there was a huge loch called Loch Spiny, which is now almost completely drained. And there was one at Rose Isle as well, which was also drained in the 19th century. In this case, Loch Spiny was starting to be drained from the 12th century. But you can see in this mapping, this is by Michael Strategos from our department, you can see that Burghead in the area around about was essentially an island cut off by the lochs and by wetlands, which are marked in green here. And so it would have been lots of kind of natural anchorages here, including this really sandy bay just to the west of Burghead. And that was the reason that the modern settlement of Burghead was constructed, was because of this natural anchorage and bay just to the west of the promontory here. So we began to do some modelling on this. This is GIS analysis looking at things like viewshed. So there's a series of early medieval promontory forts along the coast here, and this is the views you get from those sites, unsurprisingly, mainly out to the sea. But you can see their viewsheds actually overlap, so it could be that these promontory forts are part of a part of a program of construction of defences along this Moray coast here. And one of our students began to look at the kind of landing places here, and Burghead is by far the largest natural landing point on this coast here. And this is a view of 19th century, Port Knockey, which is just to the east here. This was a Pictish promontory fort, and this is the 19th century, them dragging up their boats onto the beach here. So you can see even in fairly unpromising little bays like this, you can actually land your boats next to some of these coastal settlements. Right, so just to kind of wrap up, what happens to this site? Well, that's where it gets quite intriguing, I think. So one of the beauties of this site is just the sheer number of radiocarbon dates we've been able to obtain from the site. So we've got about 150 radiocarbon dates. And you're able to now model these dates and get down to kind of decadal or generational level in terms of the dates. And that's really exciting for early historic archaeology. We can actually begin to now map on some of the archaeology to the Irish annals or other historical sources we have. So the end date is somewhere around about 900 AD. And if you remember back to the start of the talk, 900 AD is when the Pictish kingdoms disappear and we get reference to this new kingdom. And Burghead ends at the same point. Now that's really intriguing juxtaposition here. So what's going on there? Well, what's really fascinating is that some of the last phases that we have from Burghead shows some really unusual connections that can only come through contact with the Danelaw, the Viking areas in England. So we have coins from York, from Northumbria, and we've got coins of the famous King Alfred dating to the 870s. But all these coins are probably in circulation in the 870s, and they turn up in Viking camps in places like Torskey in northern England. It's the kind of bribes or tribute that the Vikings are extracting from kingdoms like Wessex in this time period. So if we look at the Burghead examples, this is Burghead, this Alfred coins here, for example, and you can see the only other examples come way, way further south in the Danelaw areas here. And now Burghead has got more 9th century coins than the rest of northern Scotland combined. So there's really intriguing evidence here for connection with these Scandinavian raiders and settlers in this late 9th century context. And then some really exciting find came out last summer, and that's a fragment of a dirham. So these are Islamic coins. And again, these come via Scandinavian raiders and traders and settlers in the 9th century into the early 10th century. They're incredibly unusual in Scotland. We've just got a tiny fragment. But a metal detectorist very recently, just a few miles from Burghead, found two other examples, a complete dirham and a fragment of one. And these would probably date to around about 900 AD. So again, they're right at the end of the sequence of the site. So what's going on here? Clearly contact with the Viking armies and the Danelaw armies. And that's perhaps not surprising. So again, the kind of few sources we have for Pictland talk throughout the 9th century about repeated encounters between the Picts and the Vikings. And that includes events like in 839, where innumerable men of Fortru, so this is thought to be the Overkingdom located in the Moray Firth area, are killed by the Vikings. And then all the way through to around about 900, there's this really interesting reference to Eamar, killed by the men of Fortru, so Scandinavian ruler here, killed by the men of Fortru, and there's a great slaughter around him. So this is a victory. And this is one of the very last references to that Overkingdom of Fortru in 904. If you remember, the end date of Burghead is 900-ish. What do we have at Burghead? Well, our seaward rampart has been completely destroyed by fire. Is this evidence of an attack? So you can maybe just make out all the burnt stonework of the big wall that encloses the seaward end of the site. And this is burnt through from the sea side here. And then just to the south of Burghead is this really, really interesting monument known as Sweno Stone. So it was named after a later Scandinavian ruler. But it's Pictish in style and tradition, and it's got this huge battle scene on the background. And it's been recently interpreted as maybe showing one of these battles between the Picts and the Vikings. And it's about 6 meters high. It's incredibly majestic in terms of its ambition. And so this could well be something that's maybe marking the victory over Scandinavian settlers here, and located very close to Burghead. So is this marking the end of this major fort? And certainly the art history and the archaeological dating of this monument, again, would place this around about 900 AD. That's really exciting if we can begin to relate these two things. Right, so just to conclude, towards the end of the sequence, we can show that this community was receiving material that shows direct connections to the Danelaw. So now we need to think about how did it get there? What does it mean in terms of the ending of the site? And what did the demise of major centres like Burghead, what ramifications did that have for Pictish rulership and Pictish identity. There's a really interesting juxtaposition there between the end of this major centre and the disappearance of Picts as an identity. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks to all our funders. So.
Diolch yn fawr, Gordon. That's absolutely amazing talk about the archaeology that you found. Absolutely fascinating. So we're now going to open up to questions. If you would like to ask a question, please could you put your hand up, and then we will come over to you with the mic so everybody can hear that. And we've got plenty of time for questions. So because I'm the chair, I get to ask the first one, if that's okay. So I was absolutely fascinated to hear about all of the evidence that you found of various different types of long-distance connections. You found that through the material culture, the isotopic analysis of the cattle remains. And you talked about the end there of that particular site. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the nature of the connections throughout the lifetime of the site. So you talked about maritime connections there, you talked about violent encounters, but was it always violent? Were there sort of more benign relationships with people around?
Yes, I mean, we're obviously just going through the highlights there, but I mean, the site exists for, 2-3 centuries, so, there's a successful community there. And what's interesting is that we get these kind of long-distance connections throughout the history of the site. And the kind of signature of what we're finding there is kind of similar to some of the trading sites you get further south, but not really been found in Scotland before. So it's got this long history, I think, of being this quite important economic hub with these connections that stretch wide and far. So you wonder whether the material that we're finding, this kind of connections to the Danelaw material, is found within the floors of what look like continuations of the Pictish style dwellings. It doesn't look like the Scandinavians have suddenly landed and taken over. It looks more like this material is being reworked within these Pictish settlements, but they must have came through contact, perhaps violent encounters with some of these Scandinavians through the references to battles and the like. But being reworked in some sort of local economic situation. But you wonder whether that then led to eyes beginning to be drawn towards this place because of its wealth and its influence, and whatever happened around about 900 AD probably wasn't pleasant, I would think.
Fascinating. Can we open up to questions from the floor? Who would like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. I was actually born in Aberdeen, and my relatives, past and present, worked in the fishing industry in Peterhead, farmed in Elgin, in Afford and Rhynie, funnily enough.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And I never asked them the question because I was too young at that time. But I also wondered why the Picts, and particularly the Tapa North site that you've been looking at, they just disappeared.
Yeah.
And I'm told that they never wrote anything down. It was all passed word of mouth. But is that true?
Well, it's difficult to know for sure. I mean, Martin Carver, archaeologist at York, excavated Port Mahomet, and they've got evidence for vellum production, presumably for books. So they do look like they were producing books. We have Latin inscriptions in some of the monuments. We have Ogham inscriptions, the Irish form of writing. So they are writing things down. But how widespread that was is difficult to know. And why we've lost everything from that time period is difficult to say as well. We do have one indigenous source, the Pictish king list, but it's literally a list of kings, which doesn't tell you an awful lot about wider society. But that's where archaeology comes in, and thankfully we are beginning to find the sites that can tell us more about these societies, and that's really exciting to to find out, because I grew up in northeast Scotland as well, and I'm very embarrassed to say that I didn't know who the Picts were until I went to university and learnt about them in a class, and that's quite embarrassing, isn't it? We don't talk about these things in our schools locally. So hopefully we can begin to change that through projects like that.
So as a follow-up, have you used LiDAR around the areas to see if there are excavations that could be done, but they're not visible?
Yeah. So yeah, LiDAR and any sort of remote sensing has been hugely important for our project. So Tapa North, for example, I've mentioned this a few times, but it's a huge hill fort just overlooking Rhynie, which we think is an early Pictish royal centre. And that's, we did some LiDAR survey there, and we did use a drone as well, which can produce the same results essentially. And there we knew there was a few hundred house platforms, but the kind of modern technology suggested there's something like 800 houses on that hill, and they all date to the Pictish period. So you can go from, having no houses known from that area from the Pictish period to overnight revealing, there was 800 at one site. So it just shows you how you can begin to really transform the archaeological record through some of these new technologies, which is exciting.
One last question. The Picts fought off the Vikings. They fought off the Gaels and the Scots, if you want to call them that. Why did they just die? What happened?
I don't think they die. I think it's essentially a rebranding. So
was that to do with MacAlpine?
Well, possibly. So there's a very famous 9th century king called Kenneth MacAlpine, and already by the 11th, 12th century he was seen as the figure who destroyed the Picts, almost like a Game of Thrones style Red Wedding, where he invites all the Picts to a meal and he kills them all. But in the contemporary sources, Kenneth MacAlpine was actually referred to as a Pictish king, and it's actually some of his ancestors, his people who come after him, who gradually begin to adopt things like Gaelic names. And it seems to be, for whatever reason, the royal lineage begins to be traced back to Western Scotland and to the kingdom of Dalriada. And Pictish dies out as a language. It's possibly why we have so few sources from that period, because there wasn't interest in maintaining those historical records. That's one idea. But yeah, Gaelic becomes the language of the court, at least, rather than Pictish, which is a Brittonic language. And you get this rebranding into the Kingdom of Alba, which is a geographical term rather than an ethnic term. So I think as these kingdoms expand and they have to respond to things like, the Viking raids and the like, they begin to change, just as you get in England with the kingdoms merging and disappearing in the face of this new enemy. So I think it's more a rebranding rather than actually disappearance of them.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, Gordon. You mentioned Port Mahomack, which I guess must be almost visible from Burghead. It's, for those who don't know the area, it's across the Moray Firth on the other coast. And that has this archaeological wealth of evidence for possible destruction around about a similar time, maybe a bit earlier. Do you think there's a connection between these two sites?
I think so. I mean, it's hard to know how big an influence, if this is the Kingdom of Fortune, how big an influence did it have? It certainly seems to be the main over-kingship at times, which means it probably ruled over, what is quite a vast area in the early medieval perspective, going all the way from the Forth up to the Northern Isles and across to the Western Isles. So places like Port Mahomack, I'm sure, would have probably been ruled by whoever is not necessarily living at Burghead, but this is one of their main fortresses and one of their main power centres, I would think, in this time period. So definitely connections. And that little pressed bronze plaque that I showed with the biting beasts nearest example of that design is one of the cross slabs, Hilton Cadboll, which is on the Tarbert Peninsula where Port Mahomet is. So yeah, I think there's very clear connections to that location. And then some of the cattle as well seem to come from those kind of highland west coast areas as well. So yeah, this centre clearly had a huge reach in terms of material culture coming to this centre, and that's probably telling you about the significance and reach of the people who are in charge of this location.
Thank you for an excellent talk. Do you have any idea where the ore for the bronze and silver, hack silver, was mined and came from?
Mm-hmm. So things like the silver, well, the early silver you get, so kind of in the early phases of places like Burghead, would have all still been Roman silver. And so that gets recycled across centuries. And it's not until these Scandinavians turn up and bring in new sources of silver that you begin to get a new input into that system in terms of silver. So that's really fascinating in terms of just how rare that material must have been. So Rhynie, for example, which is this earlier centre, we've got evidence for them actually refining silver in these kind of stone vessels, and that's really unusual evidence. But we analysed, I can't remember, something like 40-odd crucibles, and only one or two actually had evidence of silver. And that's probably telling you about how rare it is compared to bronze. The rest were bronze working. So it is a very rare material, I think, even in this time period. But yeah, once you get into the 9th century, you get all sorts of new sources coming in from Islamic dirhams and all sorts of things that are beginning to circulate much more widely in this in this new Viking Age world. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Have you, I mean, obviously, while you've been digging up these structures, which are very exciting, and things like the metalworking, how do you think the more ritual side of this site, the well, the Burghead bulls, the later Christian sculpture, how does this kind of fit in, do you think, at the moment, into the overall development of the site and how it functioned?
Oh, God. Thanks, Nancy. That's a great question. So, yes, we're just trying to get to the bottom of that. So what you see in terms of what's on the ground today at Burghead is probably largely 7th century and later. But there is hints of what might be earlier phases, but just very scattered features. But it looks like in the 7th century, they completely landscaped that peninsula to build this huge fort. And the amount of, soil and sand and stonework that they're moving around might mean that, the earlier phases are gone or not very well preserved. But we get the odd radiocarbon date that suggests earlier activity. And there's some very strange things, like there's a carved stone head, like a bit like some of the Celtic ones you get. So there could be an earlier phase, and you do wonder whether the well might be associated with that early phase of ritual use of this peninsula. And then the bulls, I would say, art historically would be 7th century at the latest, maybe earlier. So again, you wonder whether they're actually coming from an earlier version of a fort or settlement on that peninsula. But in terms of where they were found in the 19th century, they seem to come from round about the entranceway to the upper fort. So maybe they're marking a kind of processional route into the, the most significant part of the fort. But you're beginning to get some really interesting spatial patterns. For example, there's only things like cereal grains only turn up in the upper citadel. So they're grinding grain, making bread and stuff in the upper fort. And the lower fort's all about craft working and the like. Sorry, getting back to your point. The kind of early Christian sculpture, there is a chapel site marked on some of the early maps called St Aidan's. So it could be a connection to Northumbria there, maybe. But yeah, that's quite unusual to have a chapel within a fort like this. You know, you've got places like Dundurn that had a chapel down below the fort. Or you begin to get into 9th century, you get these lowland palace complexes that probably had churches within them. But yeah, certainly there must be, you know, a kind of ritual dimension to life here throughout that sequence again, and maybe prior to the actual construction of the fort.
We have time for one last question.
Yes, so that was incredibly interesting. I did my master's on return to hill forts in post-Roman Britain, so
Yeah.
and Moat of Mark was one of the ones I looked at. But I was going to ask you, in all the forts that I looked at of the time period, they all had evidence of wine drinking.
Mm-hmm.
So they all had pottery sherds, big jars that had come from Byzantium, a lot of feasting, what all called an embarrassing quantity of beef bones at Cadbury. But you didn't say anything about what they drank.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We don't have any imports from Burghead, but the date of that, you know, that kind of big fort is after we get any imports in northern Britain, at least. So we don't have anything like that. We do have in earlier sites, places like Rhynie and Tapenoff. We've got Mediterranean, late Roman amphora. We've got glass coming from western France, which is probably the drinking goblets they're drinking their wine out of. But no, at Burghead, we don't. I think the sequence is too late, really, for those imports. Yeah.
Thank you. That is almost the most perfect question we could envisage for what's to come next, which, of course, is I would like to ask you all to please stay and join us for a drink that will be available out in the foyer. But please, can I thank once again Professor Noble for such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.